What if I told you that there was a single super easy to learn opening that could carry you to up and over 1700 elo on any chess platform? That opening is the Stonewall attack, a lethal option you can play with both the white and black pieces. In the next 14 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how you can master it and blow open your opponent's defenses before they even realize what you've got hidden up your sleeves. If you're tired of blundering, just like I was, and ready to consistently play over 90% accuracy in your games, then this is going to be the opening for you. After you learn the Stonewall, you'll be able to climb the rating ladder with ease. For me personally, it did exactly what I told you and skyrocketed my elo to over 1700 in just a couple months. I know it can do the same for you if you follow these easy to learn principles. Playing with white, you're going to begin with your queen's pawn to d4 to take control of the center. The next few moves from your opponent will probably look something like this. They'll fight back in the center by playing their pawn to d5. You are then going to play e3 to open up a path for your light squared bishop. Your opponent will now most likely develop their knight to f6. You're going to continue with your plan and bring your bishop to d3. The bishop on this diagonal is an absolute monster. I want you to think of this bishop as the key piece to setting up and delivering checkmate to your opponent in most of your Stonewall games. On this diagonal, the bishop attacks their weak h7 square and sets up a massive attack. Another bonus to playing your bishop out to d3 is that it really restricts your opponents from bringing their bishop out to f5. Since they can't do that, your opponent will typically react by counter-attacking you in the center by playing their pawn to c5. With c5, they're now threatening two ideas. First, they can take your central pawn. Secondly, they're threatening to push on the next move to attack your bishop, gain space, and if you notice, your bishop will have nowhere to go except backwards, removing it from its powerful diagonal. This makes it a very passive bishop. You're not going to want to have a passive bishop, so we're going to have to deal with both of these threats. The best way to deal with both of these threats is by playing pawn to c3. This is a key move if you ever face c5. Just train yourself to automatically play c3. Even as early as move 3 in the game, you can see c5, and you'll still want to respond by playing c3. c3 makes it so if they ever decide to trade in the center, you can always take back with a pawn. It now also gives your bishop a place on the strong diagonal you want it on to drop back to if they ever push, so it deals with both threats. Not only that, c3 also repels any knight jumps to b4, which would also be some major threats on your bishop. Hopefully you're seeing the theme here on how important it is to keep this bishop happy on the right diagonal. It's also very rare in an opening, but in the Stonewall, you're going to want to develop the bishop before the knights. After this, you'll typically see your opponent play e6 to free a space for their dark squared bishop to come out and get ready to castle. We'll cover later on what happens if they decided to bring out their light squared bishop before closing it in, or if they decide to trade in the center first. After e6, we are going to respond with knight to d2. This move adds a defender of the important central e4 square, making it sure we have both our bishop and knight controlling this square. This prevents your opponent from advancing and taking control of this central outpost. To illustrate, I will briefly show you an example of what happens when we do not protect against it. Black can easily jump their knight into the center, then support that knight with one of their pawns, for example the f-pawn, by pushing it to f5. If you look at this example, you are the one getting stonewalled, and you'll struggle to break through for the rest of the game. For this reason, it's very important that you do not let this happen, and that you have a very good grasp of the center. From here, they will likely play one of two moves, either bishop out to d6 or knight to c6. Both of these moves develop a piece and try to take control of an extremely important central square on e5. If they can control e5, they can then push their e-pawn and try to mess up our entire Stonewall setup. So if you ever see the knight, the bishop, or any other piece for that matter setting up to take control of e5, even early on in the game, you should respond by playing your pawn to f4. f4 completes the wall. With this pawn structure, you're making it extremely difficult for your opponent to do anything. You gain more space, restrict their pawn advancements, and if your f-pawn ever gets traded off, this gives you a completely open file for your rook to attack with without needing to move it at all. Playing f4 before bringing out your knight also makes it so your f-pawn is not getting trapped behind the knight, and it's now free to continue advancing and set up future pawn storming ideas. One last thing, f4 also opens a window for both your rook and queen to maneuver over to the kingside attack in the future. There are, however, two slight drawbacks to playing the move f4 that are important for you to be aware of. One is that it exposes this diagonal for your king. Always be aware of your king's safety if your opponent lines up on this diagonal, as they'll be setting up some potentially dangerous threats. Never be afraid to sidestep to h1 if you need. Just know that this sets up some potential back rank mating problems. So always be aware of that and make sure you can push a pawn up if you need some space. The second drawback is that it no longer defends your pawn on e3, as you just jumped past it. Your opponents will likely try to attack this e3 pawn, typically with their knight landing on either g4 or d5. If you neglect to defend e3 at this point and you just castle, you'll actually be blundering a fork, losing the exchange and a pawn in the process. This is a terrible position to be in, so don't let this happen, and don't say I didn't warn you. It's really easy to defend against this threat, and you can simply protect e3 by moving your queen up and then castle on the next move. At this point of the game, the opening phase is pretty much over in a major success. We have our strong pawn wall chain and a happy bishop. Now all we need to do is finish getting out the rest of our pieces and then figure out a way to set up our attack. Before anything else, let's address one typical trade you will often see. Either at this point of the game or earlier, black might decide to trade pawns in the center. Keep in mind that if your opponent ever decides to do this instead of pushing by to attack your bishop, you are going to want to take with your e-pawn, as that is going to be the most advantageous for you. Taking with the e-pawn opens the e-file. It also opens up your dark squared bishop, which up until this point wasn't doing a whole ton. Most importantly, it keeps your dark pawn chain strong, repelling all of black's pieces. In any attack, it's best to have your pawn structure directed at the side you are wanting to attack on. In this case, we're setting up a kingside attack. Only take with your c-pawn if there is no other choice, like in this example, where your dark squared bishop is currently being blocked by your knight, so we would end up losing our f-pawn if we decided to trade with our e-pawn. To avoid that, we would take back with our c-pawn. This is not so bad and actually happens very frequently. So just always do a double check before making this trade. After this, black will castle. You're then going to finish developing up your last minor piece and also get ready to castle yourself by playing knight to f3. This knight will aim for the central e5 outpost, where it will be supported by both your d4 and f4 pawns. If black doesn't dislodge this knight in the center of the board, it becomes an absolute monster, setting up all sorts of traps, sneaky threats, and sacrifices that would completely open up your opponent's king, so you can then go for a checkmate. If your opponent does decide to trade off your knight themselves, this will only backfire on them and restrict their position even further. And there you have it. This is the perfect Stonewall. This is what you're going for. Your move order will be different depending on what your opponent plays, but just keep this position in mind and you can always try to get here. With white, you'll have your dark pawn chain with pawns on c3, d4, e3, and f4, and all of your pieces out. Your bishop on d3, both of your knights on d2 and f3, and a safe king that has been castled on the king side. And playing with black, you'll have your light squared pawn chain with pawns on c6, d5, e6, and f5, with your bishop on d6 and both your knights on d7 and f6. Same thing, you'll have a safe king that has been castled on the king side. Now that we've gone over the perfect Stonewall setup that you're going to be going for in your games, we can now cover all of the different attacking ideas, as well as piece maneuvers, which are going to get you into winning positions, as well as set up sneaky checkmate threats. The first plan is going to be by developing your queen. You can do this by playing the move queen to e1. This move looks very strange, sliding over only one space, but it has a very direct threat. Remember that window that we talked about that we created when playing the move pawn to f4? Well, now we can utilize this window for all of our pieces. The queen can now come to h4 directly. Here the queen paired with the bishop sets up an immediate checkmate threat on h7. Often this will be guarded by either a knight or another piece, so this gives you a very direct plan to try and eliminate that piece and go for checkmate. Oftentimes you can accomplish this with either a pawn, your bishop, or any other piece, but just keep this in mind. Many of your opponents will simply not know how to defend against this. They may try to push a pawn, but remember that whenever they push a pawn in front of their king, it's only going to weaken their position further, and you have your queen there ready to attack. Your next plan is going to be to perform a rook lift. After you drop your knight into the center, there's now room for you to play your rook to f3. Then you can swing it over to either g3 or h3 and line it up with the queen that is now on h4. This sets up all sorts of checkmate threats and pressure. Your next plan will be to finally develop your last minor piece, your dark squared bishop. And you're probably wondering why we haven't developed it sooner. The reason is this. The bishop here does a great job at defending the base of your pawn chain on b2, especially if your opponent ever tries to attack b2 with their queen coming to b6. This just leaves everything solid and defended, and then you can worry about the safety of your king. Eventually, however, it will be important to bring your dark squared bishop into the game. You could go for a fianchetto on b2, but here the bishop is not very active, and it's just staring into the back of your own pawns. My recommendations, and one of my favorite ways to get this piece to come alive, is by rerouting it to the queen side in a zigzag pattern. This takes 3 total moves by playing bishop to d2, bishop to e1, and finally landing it on h4. Obviously, you cannot make this maneuver with your knight still on d2, so you'll have to move that knight first. Here on h4, the bishop applies a ton of pressure. Since it's one of your most limited pieces already, as it's on the same color square as 6 of your pawns, it's typically a really good idea to use this piece to trade for one of your opponent's defending pieces of their king. You can also leave it here as it often causes a very annoying pin. Once your bishop is in place on h4, I also wanted you to play around with this bonus attacking idea of starting a pawn storm attack and launching your g-pawn to g4. You can use it to get rid of your opponent's knight and then try to invade with your queen and go for checkmate. In many positions, you can also use your pawn to break open their king. This is something your opponents likely will never have faced before, so there are plenty of opportunities for them to go wrong. You will have tons of fun in these types of positions, so go ahead and give this a try as well. Now, let's move to your other bishop. One of the most common tactical attacking ideas and sacrifices you'll see in these Stonewall structures is the Greek gift sacrifice. This is a powerful tactic where you sacrifice your bishop on h7 to draw out the enemy king into the open. It's brilliant and leads to a wonderful mating attack when your knight and queen are ready to follow through. But here's the thing with the Greek gift sacrifice. It doesn't work in every position. There are clear requirements that must be in place or the sacrifice simply doesn't work. You will have sacrificed your best attacking piece for nothing. To make sure you have a crystal clear understanding of all of the requirements for this sacrifice and how to make it work, I will be making another video in the future, so make sure you check that out. Other common ways to utilize this piece will be trying to sacrifice it for some pawns that have been pushed in front of the enemy king if you have clear follow-up, like in this example. That's pretty much all of the plans that we will cover today for the light squared bishop, but always keep your eye out for tactics. One more idea I wanted to leave you with is an important plan that you can try early on if your opponent is not fully controlling the center. This plan is instead of playing d4 and then e3, you can go for an early e4, e5 push and then support it with f4. This gives you much more space in the center and limits your opponent's pieces. It also is way more aggressive. You can start to open things up early on. If you are very comfortable in these types of positions, this is a much more aggressive approach that you can try. If you're not as comfortable, I would recommend sticking with the normal setup. Finally, we talked early on in this video about what would happen if they bring their knight out before blocking it in with their pawns and they try to go for a pin on your knight on f3. This happens very frequently. If you ever see this, don't panic. There is a very cool trick and move you can do to begin an attack on them. This will likely be something they've never seen before, so let's get into it. You can play the move knight to h4 as long as you move your queen first. Now, at first glance, you might question this move. It looks wrong putting a knight on the edge of the board, right? But here it's actually setting up a very sneaky attack. With your knight gone, the bishop now is hitting nothing. It's extremely out of place and you can begin to attack that bishop. To begin your attack, you are going to start a pawn storm by playing h3 and g4. These directly gain tempos on the bishop, forcing it all the way back, and you'll notice your knight is in perfect position to make this trade. This now opens up the enemy king further and you can continue your pawn storm advancement, or you can start to bring your other pieces and start a devastating attack. Like I said, if you ever see them try to pin this knight, don't be afraid and give this a try. If your opponent decides that they want to trade their bishop with your knight on f3 before you can start your pawn storm attacking idea, you are actually really happy in this position because you now have the bishop pair. If you already moved your queen to release that pin, you can recapture with your rook to keep your pawn structure healthy. If it trades before you ended up moving the queen, you can really take either way. I would suggest using the queen as this helps it get to a much more active position. You can then begin to apply more pressure. Now that we have covered all of the different attacking plans that you're going to be going for in your games, let's now move on to discuss all of the potential mistakes that your opponents will make. That way you know exactly how to take advantage of them and get into better positions. The first and most common mistake that you will see in these setups is when they decide to trade knights in the center, not realizing that once you take back, they're immediately blundering a fork between their bishop and knight. If they see this fork, they might drop their bishop back to prevent this and then still voluntarily make this trade. The important thing to realize is that when they do make this trade, it actually removes an important defender, the other knight, on f6. In this position, you're doing much better, you have more space, and you can continue your attack by bringing your queen out, paired up with your bishop to attack the weak h7 square. If they decide to block with their pawn, you can then go for the rook lift idea that we've already discussed, and you can go for checkmate. The second most common mistake that you'll see your opponents make that you can take advantage of is when they decide to jump their knight into e4 without realizing that you have two attackers and they only have one defender. After the dust settles and you decide to make this trade, you'll notice that you end up winning a pawn. From this position, you're completely winning, staying a pawn up, and if you trade everything, this pawn could win you the game. That is all we have time for today. Hopefully you learned a lot on the Stonewall setup. I hope you have a ton of fun playing these positions. If you wouldn't mind taking 2 seconds, go ahead, smash that subscribe button, hit the bell icon so you stay up to date on any future videos. And again, I will be linking below all of the other videos I have on the Stonewall setup. I also have a whole entire series where I do a rating climb playing exclusively the Stonewall attack, so you can kind of see some of those positions I get into. Again, thank you so much for joining me. We'll catch you on the next one.